Hello, everyone. I'm going to add Marissa here and we'll get started with our conversation. Thank you for being here as always, and I still have not figured out how to gracefully start one of these. Okay, so she is invited and hopefully we'll be there in a second. So thank you for joining us as always. Let's see. There we go. Okay, I think that was faster than the last couple times I've done it.
We're figuring this out.
I'm so sorry. Okay.
That's great. Okay. See if we're not too filtered.
Where's the music coming from? Is that me? That is me.
No. Is it me?
No, I
still don't have new earbuds or whatever, so I hope these don't click.
No. I'm trying to figure out if there's like a page on my computer somewhere. Oh yeah, there's a page on YouTube that's playing. That's so funny. I'm working on an article on conference worship, worship conferences and stuff. And so I was like, why am I hearing the introduction to Passion 2024 in my head? Okay, that's why.
But you were at a conference recently.
I was.
Oh, we haven't talked since then.
It was really, really fun. It was it's the first trip I've taken solo since having kids, which was it was wonderful. I was very nervous, but it went really well. Oh. There were no tears from kids, I'm told. Great. Which is great. And yeah, it was really, really fun. It was for the Society for Christian Scholarship in Music. And they change their location every year, but this year was in Wheaton, which is driving distance. So that was easy. Nice. Yeah, presenting some research I've been working on with some folks who I've been really excited to meet for a long time, but have not gotten to meet because I really started doing this research during COVID times. Okay. And I haven't really been able to travel much since then. So it was very fun. Very excited to be able to do it.
Were you like, no one beats me, here I am?
Yeah, it was I told Casey, I'm exhausted, but in a way I don't think I've been exhausted since grad school. Exhausted by just adult conversations, which were lovely, but I haven't had that much adult socialization. I don't think in, I don't know, 6.5 years. So
that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. How are you all doing?
We're making it. Yeah, we're making it. This is always a little crazy. My husband is a priest, and so we have Holy Week is the big, busiest,
coming,
fullest time. So that's coming. So everything's kind of orbiting around that.
Yeah.
Good. And it's starting to be spring here, so that's all great.
Yeah. Same here. It's nice.
I see my daffodils and tulips are up, which is the hope of spring because it's so great.
Yeah. Have they bloomed? Or are you just seeing the buds?
Daffodils have bloomed, and one little planter of tulips has bloomed, but they usually all come in the next week or two, which is good. We need that.
Yeah, we do too. We don't have any blooms yet. Our daffodils are there. These little buds.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how Tuesday night goes. We're just trying different live times, see how they go. Friday night was not very exciting. We'll see how Tuesday night goes, but it's good to get the conversation. Mm-hmm. And I love that we're also figuring out how to upload to YouTube so that people can get it later.
Yes, apologies to everyone every time we do one of these, it records to my Instagram, but downloading it from Instagram to my phone to my computer does not work as quickly as I'd like every time. And so I must have tried it a couple times. It took too long. And so I gave up and then forgot to try again. So I will upload this one and our previous one on Tradwife content soon. I'm going to try it after this and see if I can get it to work quickly enough. But I'll have some time tomorrow set aside to work also. So hopefully that will be.
Thank you for doing that. But it's always, I'm still learning but it's always tricky when it's you need more storage in your phone and then you don't have enough storage and it takes a long time anyway.
So anyway, we'll get the next one.
The convenience of just hopping on together comes at a cost.
But I'll figure it out, I promise. So, but thank you to everyone who's here and who joined us last time too. But we are excited we've already talked a bit about spanking and corporal punishment, but there seems to be, unsurprisingly maybe, a lot of interest in this topic. And so we wanted to jump on and maybe talk about it in some different ways, and in light of the way that the conversation has changed since we talked about it last time. So I thought maybe to start out with, could you maybe outline how you kind of ended up jumping back into this topic so heavily all of a sudden? Because it was one that you had talked about before, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, there's a real interest in revisiting this.
Right. And I'm trying to think what now it's all lost what the actual impetus was. It's usually something, there must have been an article or something on Twitter, maybe. You remember? Did I say something? I don't know what. There's usually something like that that just reminds me, because usually the responses from people remind me how much this is a hill some parents want to die on, and how vehement the pushback is if you begin to challenge it. But do you remember? Did I say what the impetus was?
The comments are saying Gospel Coalition article and started on Twitter. And so I think that's right. I think so. The last one that we did was a response to the
Gospel Coalition.
Well, we did the one on the gentle parenting article, which was a terrible article.
Yes, but it had elements of corporal punishment in it. Oh, I know what it was. It was just, I think it was something kind of random. Someone had responded to, I think it was like a Doug Wilson video or something, but I had just posted, look, nowhere in scripture does the Bible, nowhere do we get a mandate that parents should hit their small children, should spank their small children, anything. And it kind of blew up on Twitter. And I think the responses are the usual kind of responses. If you speak about this at all, you kind of get some of the same responses, which I think are, it's information, right? As to how people are holding this view, how people are defending this view, how people perceive any pushback against it. But it just reminded me how wild it is to me that Christian parents in particular, Christians in particular, not even only parents, continue to insist not only is this required, but the Bible commands it or God commands it, and it's just not there. And so I think the inaccuracy of that kind of makes my head explode a little bit, biblically and theologically speaking. But yeah, so anyway, I think that is what started it off again. And then I thought, well, if I'm jumping into it, I'll go a little deeper this time and kind of see it through in a more cohesive way.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I know some of y'all follow Flourishing Homes and Families on here, and they also last week, I think, ran a series on why spanking isn't. So the timing of that generated a lot of conversation, I think, on Christian social media. But
yeah, Christian Twitter. I sometimes wonder like how much to respond to stuff that happens on Christian Twitter, because you just get people being, I don't know, stirring the pot or trying to take the most extreme view possible, or just being contrarian. I don't know, because they feel like a particular contrarian viewpoint. But this is one that I think is, I say that, and then I think, you know what, but in the circles I run in here, I know many evangelical parents who still really go to bat for spanking as a discipline method. Not in the same like posturing tone that people on Christian Twitter do, but yeah, it's definitely there. So yeah, someone just commented Reformed Christian Twitter is another animal. Yeah, and
definitely. And well, and this is something I will always, when I can, within reason, comment about corporal punishment, because I think it is something that is so important to have Christians publicly naming that this isn't biblical, that this isn't particularly in scripture, that it is a Christian cultural thing, not so much to convince like the commenters on Twitter, but because I think there are plenty of people reading those threads or coming across. And I think if you are in, for instance, Reformed Christian Twitter or communities where this is the only conversation, this is the norm, sometimes you're not exposed to the idea that, oh, but other Christians are making a case against it. And I think always it's worth it, not in like a saviorist mindset, but often because sometimes I will hear from parents, particularly mothers, and it really is online conversations or quietly reading that becomes a gateway to think about it differently without feeling like, oh my gosh, this is a slippery slope, but oh, maybe there's a different way to come at this. But I think it's the first time I got blocked from a group on Facebook or something was over this. Like, people get serious, you know, and I think you begin to see that and see this is, I don't know if you'd call it like the golden calf. It's not at that level, but it really is something pivotal for people. And I think there's a fear to let it go. So anyway, I think it's always worth some conversation about it. But I told Aaron, I was like, sometimes I feel just tired of talking about it. Aaron's my husband, like tired of talking about it because I feel like the friends and family who, you know, I'm friends with on Facebook who just get these auto posts or like, oh, another post. Corporal mentioned, you know? But I think it's worth it. So I'm glad we're talking about it again.
Well, someone just posted down there, it's a litmus test for penal substitutionary atonement, which I know we kind of wanted to start in the arena of theology for this one, just sort of talking about the theological underpinnings of the justifications that have become really popular, right? And there are different variations of these depending on the person, right? Like, I see so many different variations on like application of penal substitutionary atonement to the application of corporal punishment, which I think is really interesting. And I think it's interesting to see how it's applied differently depending on who's doing it. So I don't know, you start, because you are the theologian here. And I have thoughts, but that is your purview.
Well, I think, yes, penal substitutionary atonement is a key piece of it. I also think, honestly, I think for many people, they have vague theological ideas. I don't know if it's as crisply defined. Like, I think some people, if you talk to, yes, they may say, oh, here's the theological system, the theological assumptions. But I think others are more kind of like what you see in Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart, where there's a vague understanding that we need to think about the cross in discipline. We need to bring children to the cross. There needs to be some, or the Gospel Coalition article, right? There's some sort of atonement, and pain is important, and suffering, and they throw in Hebrews 12, like, oh, sons suffer. And so I don't know if it's as crisply defined often, but when you begin to topple that belief, then I think it pulls on some of those threads, because if God isn't there punishing us if we fail to comply, if God isn't responding that way, then what's our motivation for obedience? Because under this system, you need to teach children to obey so they can obey God. And the way you do that is by painful punishment. And so therefore there's a mirroring going on. So I think you're right. The theological underpinnings can be as varied as the people holding them. But they're often not vague, in the same way that people try and make a biblical case without really doing the exegetical work to understand that case, which is how you end up people being like, the Proverbs mean God wants Christian parents to swat small children on their bottoms or something. You know, they're not even categorically the same what the Proverbs are talking about, let alone the interpretation there. But I think that general concept is there. Plus, and I saw someone, the comment is gone, but someone was sort of saying, often people think, oh, this is a drift from scripture if you give this up. This is a progressive slide. This is, you know, you're trying to make the scriptures say something they don't, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a lot of like fear for that. And all the series I'm doing now currently of why are Christian parents so reluctant, I don't think every Christian parent has all those reasons, but a lot of them often combine. So it's like these theological assumptions, but also it means questioning my parents. It means, what else am I going to do? It's all of these together. But the one everyone's willing to pull out is the theological one, because that sometimes is the trump card for people, and sometimes also is the one we're maybe least uncomfortable with. Parents do have discomfort because it shifts the responsibility over to God. So rather than say, well, it's the only tool I have, and I really need to, it's really important for me to get compliance for a variety of reasons. Yeah. It's easier to say that. But we did get one question that kind of had a theological, so for an example that I wanted to address, and someone wrote and said, a family member talks about God bringing pain and death to Israel in the wilderness as justification for the painful punishment of children. So in this person is seeing the Old Testament, God's relationship with the people of God in Israel, they perceive that as a metaphor for growing up, and therefore spanking becomes kind of a warning, a type for how sin can lead to death. And there's a lot in there. I mean, I don't know if for many people it's that precise. Oh, somebody else saying theology of total depravity. Absolutely. I don't know if for many people it's that precise of like, okay, the wilderness wanderings play in here. But I think that general sense is worth looking at, because I think for a lot of people, there's a sense of, well, that is what God does, though. If you don't behave, if you don't repent, oh, look, this is what ends up happening. And I wanted to touch on that one just because it has a lot of the same fallacies that crop up no matter which theological example people bring up. Because first of all, there's an easy equating of, okay, so hermeneutically speaking, most of the scripture comes to us as story, in story form, right? It's narrative, the bulk of it. So we can extract principles from it. Carefully would be the goal with careful hermeneutics and exegesis. But a lot of times there's an easy conflation going on there, as this person maybe has done, of like, well, here's God relating to the people of God in Israel, I don't know, 5,000-6,000 years ago. Therefore, that's how God relates to me as an individual, which I think, first of all, is an error, a hermeneutical error. And then secondly, the conclusion, therefore, because God does that, I as a parent should do that, is also maybe a leap. So you got several leaps going on where I think people understandably are trying to extract principles from the scripture, but are maybe unaware of what they're conflating there, especially with descriptive passages that are maybe not prescriptive or are not prescriptive in the way people are wanting them to be. But even if we walk down this road with this person, I would say the supposition here is erroneous as well, because we don't see God as swift to punish. The wilderness wanderings in particular are again and again and again, the people, the scripture describes the people as stiff-necked. So this is not a, oops, they forgot to obey. This is a willful, really rejection of God as he reveals himself, who he is, to the people of God who haven't known him. They've been in Egypt. He shows them what he's like through the miracles, through his provision, and they say, not only are we not going to obey, but we believe you to be evil. You brought us here to kill us. We want to go back to slavery. And they do this again and again and again and again. And again and again and again, he's merciful and compassionate and describes this way. So it's a little bit, I think, incorrect to imagine that this is a scenario where they just failed to perform and then their swift punishment came, and this is how we should respond to our children. Let alone, okay, this last thing I'll say, so we can move on, but let alone with this, because I thought it was a good question, and I hear something similar to this a lot. I think it's really interesting that even in this particular story, in Numbers 14, all the people aged 20 years and younger were allowed to enter the promised land. They were not punished. So even in this trying to force it to be about children, you see, well, children were exempt in some fashion. And I mean, I don't think it would be accurate to try and pull a principle from that and say, well, we don't, I mean, like with all of these things, this is not a passage to teach us about parenting. These stories are not. So I think that's interesting. I think when you look at Hosea 11, which is a beautiful, if you're interested in this, look it up for those of you following along. But God describes that time, and he says, he uses that metaphor, the words of the prophet are God's voice using that metaphor about the people of God as a young child that he led by the hand, that he tenderly carried, that he longed to bring to the land. And it's a very tender voice that says, I can't bear to do this against you. It's just such a stark contrast to this idea of harsh, cruel, swift, punitive response. And so I think responses like this really reveal attitudes toward God that believe him to be harsh and cruel, that believe him to behave in a harsh and cruel manner, which is, again, an interesting layer considering that's what the people in the desert were saying over and over again. You are harsh and cruel, you're harsh and cruel, we don't want that. So I don't know, but it does get complicated because for someone who's maybe holding that, if you address those beliefs, it really shakes a worldview beyond spanking.
Yeah.
And I think it threatens parental authority of how will I get my children to obey? So all of those things. But the theological ones are sometimes even harder to address than the biblical ones because they tap into things people kind of have an emotive response to, where they don't want it to be challenged, but maybe can't even express why. Or if they can, it's something like, oh, penal substitutionary atonement. Now I know that's something I need to be protective for. So anyway, it does ping on those things for sure.
Yeah. That was one metaphor, theological metaphor that I had not heard before. This understanding a parallel between God and Israel, and that was new to me. So when we got that question, I was glad to have someone bring that up, because I'm so much more familiar with kind of what one of the comments brought up, this varying mappings of penal substitutionary atonement onto corporal discipline in different ways. That I'm familiar with, but this was a little bit different, and I wonder, had you heard that one before?
I've heard something similar, not quite as detailed, but I've heard people point to God permitting judgment on whether through the exile of the people or the scattering of kingdom. Most often I hear people reference Hebrews 12, which I won't, I think I have a post on that probably somewhere, I'm sure, but which they take to mean that God hurts Jesus, and therefore parents should hurt children. And it's just, it's not a sound, it's not the purpose of that passage, but I think it also really teeters on some blasphemy to say God is the author of evil against Jesus. And you get into some of this is where things in a lot of this kind of family life teaching begin to get really murky when people are trying to put this on, especially the Trinity, the mystery of the Trinity, and you start saying, well, is God the Father punishing Jesus, the Son, under, and people try and put that on when these passages are not parenting tips. And often, I'm going to get this wrong because I don't remember the right term for it. I think the authors are trying to give us examples from human life to help us understand something greater, but we often kind of make the example the greatest thing. We invert that a little bit, and we kind of get stuck on these maybe in unhelpful ways, and they're just not meant to be prescriptive. And even Aaron and I were talking about this last week. We do a podcast with the weekly lections, the Sunday readings according to the lectionary, and just talking about how generous God is with imagery and metaphor. It's so extraordinary. It's exponentially generous, and often we'll get fixated on a few of these that then we've built whole systematic theologies around, and we maybe as a result kind of keep ourselves stuck in unhelpful ways. So anyway, I'm trying to think of other ones I hear often. A lot of times it's just a defensive attack, though. There's a lot of fragility. So a lot of times it's more you're trying to make this passage be what you want it to be, or claims of this is effeminate, this is weak, this is, all of those sort of things, or even more, which is funny to me, like, look at kids these days.
That's the favorite one. Look
at
kids these days. Look
So,
at kids these days.
I don't know. What are some other responses you've seen, or where did you want to take it from here? If people, I'm not reading the comments, I'm not very good at this, I'll peek some. Yes, Jesus was the last to be punished for sin. Absolutely. Atonement, that there would be additional atonement needed for a child's, again, this goes back to the trip stuff. Even, are we defining childish behaviors as sin? Like, on what basis? And are parents the judge of that, and meting out punishment when God has provided a way through? So it gets.
So I'll say that I know that there are multiple churches in my city that use that like have offered courses using shepherding a child's heart recently, like in the last couple years. And I was talking to one mom who took this course, and she was telling me, like, I really appreciated how they explain why spanking is a biblical form, and the way she explained it, the way that she says it was explained to her. Now, she could be misexplaining what was explained, but the way she explained it was, the way she explained it was, well, it deals with it. It shows our children how God deals with sin. Like, God dealt with sin with Jesus, one and done. And in the same way, we spank our kids, and it's one and done, and then you forget the sin. And I was like, I don't understand how that parallel maps in your brain. Like, it's a different thing.
It's a different thing, and Jesus didn't sin. And some of that depends on your view of the atonement. Like, penal substitutionary atonement is one. It's relatively recent. Personally, I'm really drawn to Christus Victor view of the atonement, which would not relate to that at all, to this metaphor. But even so, again, like all those sort of things, that doesn't necessarily mean it's prescriptive for what we are to do. Now, what we are to do is, we can see, biblically speaking, the Proverbs offer wisdom that wise parents don't neglect to instruct and discipline their children, that foolish ones do neglect that. We see in the New Testament that Christian parents are to bring their children up in the instruction of the Lord, and to not provoke or embitter their children. But beyond that, there's not a lot of prescriptive advice, which is why it always makes, I do roll my eyes pretty hard when I see the very formulaic advice, because there's nowhere to get, I think, to even the idea of spanking small children. There's really nowhere to get that there's a right way to do it, which is always what's brought out of, like, well, here's why it's not abuse if you do it this way. Well, all of that is made up. Like, everything Tripp says about the praying, the no pants, all of this is just somebody's idea. It's not, none of it. So I think it gets fraught, because then, practically speaking, people are worried. There's a lot of fear, and a lot of these resources fearmonger, right? This is the whole premise of Dare to Discipline. Like, kids aren't being disciplined enough in the young years. So there's a lot of fear of, like, if I miss the boat on this, is my child going to be, in Dobson's view, he traces that out to a delinquent, a drug addict, a criminal, violent. I think in more recent resources, it's maybe not as specific. It's more just, they're going to be disrespectful. They're not going to be a Christian.
They won't be a Christian.
Authority.
They won't come to fear the Lord. They will have a version of faith that is therapeutic deism. Like, they won't come to properly fear the Lord or something. Which, when I hear that, what I hear is, I'm afraid my child won't respect me, and that reflects them not being able to respect God. Like, if my kid can't respect me, they will never learn to respect God, which is not, I don't know that there's a reason to believe that's true. But that's a really common belief, that, like, our kids learn respect by respecting us first, and then they'll be able to respect God, and to have reverence for God, which is just to completely strip away away the possibility of conversion narratives. Like, I find that strange for evangelicals to hang so hard on that, because evangelicals traditionally do believe in powerful conversion narratives of later in life encounters with God that inspire reverence, right? Like, if we believe that's possible, we have no reason to believe that someone who had an estranged relationship with parents or didn't respect their parents wouldn't be fully capable of experiencing that.
Well, and particularly when you have things like God's kindness leading people to repentance in the scriptures, and you see nobody's punished into belief. Nobody's punished into conversion. And so this idea that that somehow would be beneficial. Honestly, I think maybe some of this too is it in contemporary cultural Christian practice, spanking is most advocated for the very early years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, parents, I think, do it much later, and it goes all manner of ways, but a by the book kind of spanking is the most early years that I think are some of the most intensive, challenging years, and often are new parents. So I think that can be overwhelming when parents are like, I don't know how to control a tantruming child, or I don't know, I'm supposed to have my child sit quietly during church and I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Or depending on which corner of Christianity you're in, you know, I'm in a family integrated church, and not I, but a parent saying, I'm in a family integrated church and my kids need to sit there and the standard is well-behaved children, and I can practice all I want at home, but I need something to get that behavioral compliance. And I think because it happens in the early years when parents are maybe less confident in their choices or are still experimenting or relying on what they saw modeled, that then it goes unchallenged. It's just something that crops up early on. And I don't know, it's so unfortunate. I feel like it's so unfortunate because, as we saw some this week, a lot of people sharing their stories, both on my posts and over on Flourishing Homes and Families. Many, many, many adults naming harm later in life. Like, it's not a, I think there may be some. I don't think it necessarily was traumatic for everyone, and a lot depended on how it was mitigated or how it happened in Christian families. But many people naming incredibly formative things coming from being spanked by parents, whether that's learning that punishment needed to be a piece of love, whether that's ending up in abusive relationships because they were taught to reconcile, whether that's people were naming kind of really the child sexual abuse nature of it, as a young child experiencing sexually confusing feelings that then became part of their sexual formation into adulthood, or people who felt like self-harm needed to be a part of their life because they needed to punish themselves if they became so foundational. And so I think to minimize it or joke about it the way adults do, or kind of say, oh, this generation's so fragile, or people are so effeminate or fragile, or anything we don't like, because we're challenging this thing. I just want to be like, why are we defending violence so much? Why are we so committed to this kind of way of being in an either or mentality? Like, there are ways to discipline, correct, and instruct that are not violent. So why are we like, no, it has to be hitting? Why is that? I mean, on so many levels, like, especially if you take away the biblical non-existent claims, why? And this makes me wonder, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, of historical. I mean, I do think some of this is in the fabric of American culture in particular. Yeah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I need to do more of a like deep dive research survey just on like popular writing here and there, just to see how people were talking about it in the ether in the 19th century, for example. But one thing that we do know is that the need to defend spanking does not arise until you start having like societal level challenges to spanking as a practice, right? Like, when you look at the writings of people who you might expect to be very pro spanking. I'm thinking like Jonathan Edwards here, yeah. Right? Like way back. You actually don't find like, and here's why you should spank your children. Because he didn't need to make that case, right? Like didn't need to make the case because it was just assumed that that was acceptable, yeah. Right? Like that's been
one interesting thing, just a tiny rabbit trail I've come across, and I haven't gone very deep down it, is the suggestion that this is a maybe much more of a marker in industrialized kind of agricultural based societies, mm-hmm. that when you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, there's much less of a reliance on corporal punishment. Yeah. And I thought that was really compelling. The thing I was reading, the article I was reading was noting that maybe this is because of things like personal property becoming of such value, and you all of a sudden have value of like societal order versus a hunter-gatherer. But certainly when you look at different cultures, I know I was listening to someone talk about Inuit parenting practices, yeah. and other things. It maybe wasn't always universal in the same way, but it is very much universal by the time you get to the Western European Christian tradition. Yeah. And maybe broader than that, would you say? Just Western tradition in general?
Yeah, so we do have like solid documentary evidence of like Jesuit missionaries going to Canada and being very just alarmed by the lack of discipline that parents were imposing on their children. Like they were like, these kids are running all over the place. These parents are way too tender with them. They are way too doting. They are way too permissive. And Jesuit missionaries were annoyed by this because it made it harder to get the children to sit in missionary schools. And so they start implementing corporal punishment. Like we know that happens in Canada in the 17th century. And I am so sorry. I am forgetting the name of the author. Maybe you remember, who has written about similar evidence existing of parenting practices in pre-colonial Africa, like Western Africa, like in the Cuba region. And I cannot remember her name now. But yes, like there is a case being made by scholars that, you know, Christian missionaries in the 17th, 18th centuries brought corporal punishment with them as a means of making children be orderly to sit and listen. You know, I feel bad that I cannot remember the name of the author, the woman who worked on that book. I will see if I can find it and add it in the tag in the video when I post it. We'll try to link the sources. But yes, there's absolutely evidence that spanking as a practice has not been universal. And certainly it was not a practice that was in any way regulated or regimented until, I don't think, the 20th century. And recently we said a little about this because Flourishing Homes and Families made a post saying that the first sort of like spanking guide that they could find was from 1936, and they referenced the Spencer Spanking Guide. And that made me laugh because the Spencer Spanking Guide is not for parents and children. The Spencer Spanking Guide is for husbands and wives to contractually enter a relationship where they consent to spanking or whipping each other for certain offenses. It's a very different thing, and that's the first time that we have this like effort to regiment and give like a procedure for how to administer this kind of punishment. Now I could be wrong about that. I have not read everything there is to read about that, but as far as I know, that's like one of the earliest versions.
Well, I think even when you, I was just going to say, even when you get to Dobson's book in the 70s, he's not giving like procedures. He's just kind of like discipline children. I mean, he does have some guidelines, but the idea that there is a right way to spank as Christians is relatively new. Very new. Corporal punishment of like, people hit children or beat their children or try and control children depending on the needs is new. I think you see it, I'm more familiar with where you see it in literature, right? You see it in the storytelling from those eras where it shows up. I did a reader's guide for the children's novel Heidi. It talks about it, like there's some references to it. So it pops up in different ways, as sort of a, yeah, this was a part of childhood. In the same way, I think of Ellen Montgomery's novels of like children getting sent to bed without dinner, kind of is. There are certain practices that kind of were community norms. But yeah, the idea that there's this way to do it, and if you do it the wrong way, that's the wrong way, and here's the right way to I don't know if it originates with Tripp in particular, but I would pinpoint that as a big piece of it, because that still circulates in a lot of communities. And the idea of praying afterward, I think that's very, very new.
Yeah.
Making it a spiritual thing.
I think, as with many things that we're going to look at in the book, a lot of it you can trace to trends in the publishing industry and the self-help industry, right? Like, because to sell a self-help book, you have to demonstrate that you have some kind of a new idea, new knowledge, new skill or tool to give. And for Ted Tripp, that meant, like, I'm going to create a system for how to do this responsibly. And I think he thought he was doing a service by saying, like, well, I'm going to give like a procedure to make this less abusive, right? Or to keep it from being abusive, or to make sure that the proper spiritual framing is there so that it is not just behavior modification, but spiritual teaching. Whereas I think everyone who was spanking by that point in the 90s was kind of like accepting that this is behavior modification and it works, and the Bible gives some underpinning to it. So but yes, I think there is a lot to be said for looking at how this is communicated to Christian parents and its connection to trends in the publishing industry as well, and what you need for a successful book.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and the mixture of desires trying to address things. And it's interesting to think about it being a way to soothe maybe people's discomfort too. That if you do have discomfort, you can be like, well, but at least I'm doing it the right way, or I'm praying with my child after, or those sort of things can soothe, because that's another piece, right? Like there's no space for a parent to, in that community, there's no place for a parent to say, you know what, this just feels horrible, I don't want to do this. And a lot of these communities are like, don't trust your feelings, don't trust your intuition, don't listen, you'll ruin your child if you listen to your God-given parental instinct. And then you get a lot of community pressure. That was another question we got, where someone said something along like, I live in a culture that is all in on spanking. Like this is the norm. How do I handle different opinions with others if I've chosen not to do that?
Yeah, that is my least favorite question. It is my least favorite question, because I do not have a good answer for that question. There's disagreement about this within my own family. So I don't know what the right answer is. I have had to kind of come to terms with having that be a little uncomfortable, because as with many of these things, it's not just a preference, agree to disagree kind of thing, right? And I feel for people who are defending it, because of course they feel more judged, because they feel like I'm looking at them and saying that they're abusing their children. So it is harder for someone defending it than it is for me. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts? I have no great
I'll
thoughts
put on my just like parent hat. This is just me talking as another parent. I think, it's very difficult because it stirs up defensiveness. It stirs up fragility. Most people don't want to hear this. And as I mentioned in some of the other videos, I really think for devout parents, the only compelling path is making a biblical case for the way of Jesus to be different than that, and to invite people to follow his example, which is not punitive, which is welcoming, which is telling his followers to instructing his followers to be known by their love, to be marked by their love. And that love does not mean permissiveness, but it also doesn't mean necessarily hitting or hurting people's bodies. So I think there's an invitation there, but it's almost always unsolicited advice in these sort of moments, right? But you are talking about the well-being of children who do not have a voice or advocate. So I think it is worth taking opportunities that are, I mean, I feel comfortable with it now after doing all of this. Maybe get some practice on some Twitter conversations, and then you'll feel a little more. But I really do think I mean, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the parents in that position, but I do think the burden of proof should be on the parents. I do feel like the discomfort should be on the adults insisting on this, and not in an ugly way, but just kind of a like, you are the one choosing that. Like, so I'm not apologetic about resisting that. But I think it also plays into ways that the communities that often most collectively advocate for that in general are not good at boundaries of a person saying, I operate in a different way. Because I think often they're not okay. Those kind of communities are not okay with someone not spanking. It's almost like I mean, I've heard from several people who are like, I was confronted by leaders in the church for posting about this, or not this week, but in the past posting about not spanking, or we were disfellowshipped for not following this way or for challenging this. And I know I heard from someone last week talking about being in a different region, and just like, people, you can't bring this up in churches. Like, it is so controversial. And so it plays into the broader, in systems where control of behavior is desired, stepping out of line, even as an adult, choosing not to spank, is not complying. And so you are going to be on the receiving end of whatever the adult version of being spanked is, right? Like, it's mirroring that. So that's the only tool offered for authoritarian systems, is to say, we will kind of threaten or punish or inflict something on someone to get them to comply. And so by opting out, you find yourself in that position. And so that's painful. I think it's painful because it can be loss of community or family stress or judgment. I think a lot of times extended family members may judge, because I think it just, sometimes it does work. And if parents are spanking young children, they appear well behaved. And so if parents are going for different goals, if the goal isn't instant compliant behavior, you can have children who are more in a learning process. They're learning regulation, they're learning. And so that can bring judgment, and scrutiny. And it's just difficult. They're tender places. I will say this, particularly separate from this, particularly when you're talking about domestic abuse, when children reflect back, and I wish I should pull some studies. So I'm going to say this in pencil and then see. But in my mind, when you're talking about children reflecting back, it can be so meaningful to have had one adult figure who was a safe or attachable person. And I'm not saying every family that spanks is abusive. Like I've mentioned before, there are ways families mitigate this in different ways. However, I think for children who are on the receiving end of that, to know that there are adults who advocated for them, to see that in different ways, if it's like family members, to see that there are different ways of doing those. I think even that can be impactful. Just doing this a different way, even quietly, can be a way to invite people to consider it. But it's difficult. To the person who wrote in with that, I'm sorry. It's difficult to navigate that. It's very tricky. And it's such a shame that it's so it's so relationally costly to choose a different parenting, even to deflate it all, to just choose a different parenting method. is so relationally
Yeah.
costly.
Yeah, I have found it really fruitful to call people's attention to the example of even God in the Old Testament and the example of Christ, which is to be willing to teach the same lesson over and over and over again,
Yeah.
you know? And I think the example of Jesus with his disciples being willing to teach the same lesson over and over again is it really it resonates with me as a parent, because that, when you have a child who's struggling to learn to emotionally regulate and not, I don't know, do whatever. I mean, I'm not even going to give an example because everyone's kid struggles with a different thing. um Having the patience and the long suffering and the faithfulness to teach the lesson over and over again, I think it's a really sad thing if we view that as permissive. I think one thing that I've had to come to terms with is that my patience, if it's perceived by other Christian parents as permissiveness, there's nothing I can do about that.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, and he taught the same thing over and over again. It was just,
Yeah.
sometimes there was frustration, and we see that, and yeah, and he still didn't smack any of them.
I know.
It's just,
Well, and I think some of it is, someone commented this week, in one of the question boxes I have, of why do you think Christian parents are so reluctant to give this up? And they were, I can't remember how they said it. It was really well stated that it's parents are not regulated doing this, like don't have those tools. And you see that even, I put in my story something, Becky Castle Miller, what she's doing a walk through Lies Christian Women Believe, that book.
yes.
And it was about the author of that book was reflecting on her like 12-year-old experience when she first got her period, and how moody she was, and just the voice in which she talked about her 12-year-old self as being, there was no excuse for her to behave that way. It was kind of her reflecting back. And I think there's a good bit of that in parents who are opting for this, of not being given maybe tools to regulate their own emotions of frustration, of overwhelm, of feeling angry, of feeling, like tired, exhausted, all these sorts of things, and being told instead maybe those are sinful, that they need to shut them down, that they need to detach. And so then there becomes a kind of like, this is what I need to do.
Yep.
Because you beautifully described this patience, the long suffering compassion of the Lord. And it's very difficult to give that when we haven't received that, even for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
It can be so anxiety producing, of like, my child isn't behaving and I don't even know why, but that is intolerable. Yeah. I cannot tolerate that, because we can't tolerate it. And ultimately, I think a lot of this reflects, particularly when you're talking about Christian spanking, because I know we've kind of talked a little bit broadly about corporal punishment in general, but when you're talking about Christian practices of spanking, I think they really do reflect a heavy yoke. Mm-hmm. Not an easy yoke, a yoke that says God is harsh and cruel and just kind of not going to tolerate your imperfection, or not going to tolerate your emotions or anything. And it's interesting, again, on Twitter today, someone had posted, I think it was a story about John MacArthur's daughter recounting when her mother was in a car accident, and she asked, is mom going to be okay? And John MacArthur kind of grabbed her face and said, don't you believe in God's sovereignty? Like, start acting like it, or something like that. But just the thought, and the person was posting it as an admirable, like, let's aspire to this kind of trust in God.
Yes, I saw this.
Did you see this? Yes. I think there's maybe it goes back to the noetic ways of thinking, but there's this disconnect that trust in God equals zero emotion, zero question, zero frustration, zero anger, or something like this, in this non-human almost way. And when those beliefs are held, then I think parents maybe are scared by their own emotions. Like, I'm angry at my child and I find that really scary, or something. And so it can be more reassuring to say, no, I'm in control. I'm going to control this situation. The behavior is going to be in control. But I do think it all comes at the cost of connection,
Mm-hmm.
connection with yourself, connection with your child, and a posture that allows
Mm-hmm.
imperfection. Um, and I think, personally speaking, maybe this is sort of related to the question the person was asking. I I try and always bring to mind that there's a quote, and I sometimes will quote, I sometimes will name it, but I kind of hesitate just because I haven't watched the movie in a long time. I don't know if it's aged well, but it's from the movie Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Maybe I talked about this in the last slide,
Mm-hmm.
which is a movie about the missionary Gladys Aylward. And I don't know, I'm not necessarily recommending the movie, but I remember this quote from it where it's someone in the community describing her as she goes into the prison or something and walking among the prisoners as someone who doesn't see um, evil or good people, but as children, all children in needing of being washed and loved and cared for. And there's something about that quote that I find really helpful to think of how even the people operating these ways, defending these practices, continuing on these generational cycles are often, we're all children of God, right? We're all children of God longing to come home, longing to be welcomed home. And I do think his welcome is there for us. The prodigal son was not castigated when he came home. He was permitted to go his own way, and his own way was not life-giving. It squandered, it injured the father even. Um and you have, in contrast, the older brother who can't believe the father's generosity, and says, I've done it all right, and you never slaughtered the fattened calf for me. And he won't go into the feast. And I think of the father saying, all that I have is yours. He says to him, all that I have is yours. And this just posture of generosity that overflows. And I think when we conflate grace with permissiveness, it maybe reveals to us we have not come to understand grace in that. Because if this is the heartbeat of the gospel, are we saying God is permissive? I don't think so. I don't think people would say that. So there's some murky misunderstandings or ways in which we approach that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Or the thing that I think is maybe happening there, the unwillingness to see how those stories apply to parents and their small children. I really do think there is this hesitance to perceive children as fully human and fully autonomous,
Yeah.
and deserving of the same kind of application of those principles as adults. So like
Absolutely.
the cost, so a parent looking at that with like it's almost like the principles of the prodigal son story are operating at a different level than what children deserve, because they are almost subhuman who need to be taught through behavior modification. Like they don't understand what my toddler understands is pain. And that, I think, is incredibly dangerous way of thinking about anyone. I mean,
Absolutely.
children, people with disabilities, the elderly, anyone. If we start using like cognitive ability to understand the grace you're being offered as being worthy of it,
Right.
then that's incredibly
Right.
dangerous. And
Or to define your humanity
yeah,
by these metrics of like, this is fully human. Yeah.
yeah. So that's, I mean, because like I can imagine a world where someone who defends spankings hears you describe the story of the prodigal son that way, and there's this sort of pragmatic turn that a lot of like that I could see Dobson or someone like James Rosemond taking,
Yeah.
which is like, yeah, but like kids need to learn to obey, like almost
Right.
just a dismissive of those higher principles in the interest of the very pragmatic in the moment concerns of parenting small children. And
Yeah.
I think that is a very secular worldview. In fact, like it's a very kind of like, let's ignore human dignity for a moment, so that we can get the behavior we need out of our kids.
And it's really, utilitarian, and I would say efficient as well. And I do think it's a piece of modern family life. There is a sense of like, if you're at this pace or you have school you need to behave in, or church, there are some pragmatic concerns. But again, I think we find ourselves with like a false dichotomy, if that's the right word here. Like it doesn't have to be either I spank or my child will never learn to obey societal norms or something. Like, but we set up this false dilemma for parents of like, if you don't do this, then that. And then, as we've talked about before, often there are so few other tools, right? Even in Tripp's book, this is one of the two, and the other is like making an environment conducive to your child's like conversion. So a lot of parents aren't given more tools except the expectation. I think often a lot of these resources write very large, the stakes, the expectation that you have to have obedience, you have to have compliance, and then not many practical tools are offered, or it's spanking or a few very specific methods. And so parents feel like, oh, this is my primary goal. So how else am I supposed to do that? How am I going to make some, and you want to like free people from that basket of like, and I think it snowballs into other things, because then I think parents feel like, yeah, it's on my shoulders to make sure my child becomes a Christian, which is I don't even know how we get there, but I think you shared a reel with me recently of it was like a very short clip of a Christian mom kind of saying, nothing I do will be as important as, right? Something along those lines.
It was the girl, there's a little girl like walking towards in the rain. She has an umbrella, and it's like, I want my children to make it to the boat. This mom imagining like we're in like, if we were in the times of Noah, I would want my children to be saved from the flood. Like, I mean, just like really brutal imagery, and also a weird understanding of what the flood narrative is supposed to be. I mean, it just is strange, but just this incredible pressure, like, get your kid on the boat, like make sure your kid makes it to the boat. I'm like, what boat? It's like,
well, and just even the idea that parents, I mean, I think it's very like, I want my children to love the Lord and follow. I think that's an understandable desire, but the idea that parents would feel like it's in their power or on their shoulders to achieve that, or that if they do something wrong, it could somehow mess that up beyond the Lord's unfailing kindness to generation after generation, that it would somehow diverge here. And that it's in their hands rather than in the hands of each individual. This is something we see in scripture, that people have autonomy to choose to follow the Lord or not. And so I think it's an immense amount of pressure, and all of that remains unexamined. And absolutely what you said about children being seen as less than human. And I think about this a lot with the rarity of the one anothering verses, the rarity of love your neighbor showing up in Christian parenting resources. There's a lot of emphasis, and a lot of, to be fair, a lot of more recent resources don't outline corporal punishment as a necessity. Most often they dodge it. Like, I think Dobson and Tripp really would have included chapters in it, and the older books you see chapters on it. A lot of the more recent ones, they don't have whole chapters on that. They'll kind of say it's a family's decision, it's a personal, they'll kind of like take the, I think it's cowardly middle of the way, because they maybe feel uncomfortable landing here and saying, like Tripp did, you have to do this, but they're also not willing to make the case against it, because people will be upset, they'll get the pushback. So to be fair, that's less so, but I think what you see operationally, particularly in conservative corners of Christianity that are suspicious of secular authorities, buck the secular trends, or however that's perceived, it's very much still part and parcel of what Christian families are operating by. And I often think in the same way, I mean, so many things in the New Testament we could see how radical it is that Jesus brings a child into the midst and says, and sets a child as exemplary. Children have always been seen as less than human in many ways, and this is remarkable. And I think a lot of the parable of the unforgiving servant who didn't, received mercy and turned around and was exacting with the person under their authority. And we don't apply these to parenting. And it's curious that we're willing to grab Hebrews 12 as a parenting model, or metaphors in the Old Testament as a parenting model, but maybe not the direct instructions to Christians of how to behave in community, in the community of our families. Like, that's less likely. The general principles. I mean, people pull the household codes ones, but less likely to be like, with all compassion and kindness, forgiving one another, bearing with one another, restore the one who sins family, all of those things. So anyway, you had also wanted to talk, since we're talking about the personhood of children, a little bit, if you have time, about parents' rights and how this plays in. I think that was the other thing.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I think one, you talk about skepticism of secular authorities. So one reason why I think some of these more recent books sort of dodge the question on spanking, one reason, not the only reason, but one, it is that in some circles, attacks on spanking are kind of seen as like an inroad for the government to regulate parenting, because I think there is this deep fear that the government is going to legally ban spanking, which it is not in the United States, right? So like the government
it is in many other countries.
Right. So like, your neighbor cannot call Child Protective Services on you for spanking your children in the US. And so this is why, like, I think spanking kind of becomes a weird like proxy for parents' rights stuff, because it's sort of seen as this like, the government shouldn't tell us how to raise our children. The government should have as few inroads to my family as possible. And when you start restricting this, then you can restrict other things, or you can interfere in other ways in my life and the way that I raise my children. And so, at least in my view, I think some parents who might otherwise be more open to a discussion will maybe plant their flag in spanking a little bit sooner, because they perceive it as like a threat to their parental authority and autonomy. And that, I that is more political than theological, right? That's sort of a political concern. And I think that we see that playing out in a lot of ways right now. I think there's this like alignment of the people who I see online defending spanking, or the people who defend, homeschool and school choice, anti-vax,
unregulated, usually,
all of it. And they're not all the same people, but those people exist in the same ecosystem, and they are animated by the same kind of libertarian, conservative, sort of separatist impulses, right? This kind of life set apart, and I should be able to create the exact life set apart that I want to create for my family. And so I think that aspect of the spanking debate kind of flies under the radar, because spanking seems so separate from like homeschooling and school choice, but I actually think they're very, very closely tied together. And I think there's also this reaction that it's like, if the government wants to ban spanking, it's because this is either persecution, or because like this is a good thing and the government is going to take this thing away, right? To restrict our ability to build the kingdom here. I think there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking that goes into seeing it that way, but I do think that that's at least a part of this.
Well, and I think it's so interesting, because when you think about the authoritarian church systems that tend to see this as a good, see corporal punishment as a good way to maintain authority, do not want any external authority, right? So yes, I want, as a parent in this system, not me personally, but the person saying, I want unrestricted authority over my children. Who dare challenge my authority a little bit? And I'm not saying it's particularly Christian to have the government involved in spanking decisions. Personally, I think the followers of Jesus should be examining, is this practice in alignment with the way of Jesus? Not, do I have the right to do it or not to begin with? But if you get to that question, it's interesting that there's a resistance to any authority beyond one's own feeling of like, God has given me authority, is resistant. So if you're, if someone would come tell me, and I think you see it even in the, like, you're right, you can't report for spanking, but if you try and ask someone, well, what's the line between spanking and abuse? When does it cross over? Which, if you want to debate with someone, I don't necessarily recommend it. It's a helpful question to ask because people can't answer it very crisply because it's all subjective. And it really comes down to parental intent, which is always behind closed doors and always determined by the one in power doing it. So it's such a dangerous thing, I think, for Christians to advocate for. It actually reminds me quite a bit of the conversation around homeschooling regulation, because as someone who's been a homeschooling parent off and on over the years, I hear those conversations a lot, and while I understand some of the concerns, it seems to place a value on a perceived right over the well-being of the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
To say, okay, I don't think it's an option for parents, Christian parents, to spank, but say there was a way to do it in some permissible way, the right way to do it. We all know there are countless children experiencing egregious abuses in that name, though. It isn't always being done in the right way. So at what point do we say, well, my right to this perceived good, if you can even call it that, is worth, kind of neglecting the most vulnerable? And similarly with things like homeschool rights and other things, like, understandably, but we know there's educational neglect. We know that there's isolation. So at what point, how do we, as community members, as Christians with obligations to our neighbors, to love one another and care for one another, and that feels uniquely American to me. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
No, I think it is.
My individual right to my autonomy and my authority is supreme. It's going to be the priority over all else.
Yeah, I think this reminds me. I think you told me that John Piper once said, "I would rather go to prison than not be able to spank my children." And to me, I'm just like, okay, that's truly taking out a political position. Just like, you can take my guns when I'm dead. That's that kind of a situation. Like it's truly putting something on the level of I must have this, or I am being restricted from practicing my faith, which is a wild thing to stake out for spanking, right? For a thing that is in the form that it's practiced today, very, very new in Christian circles. In the form it was practiced before was just child abuse. And I the homeschooling and religious lobby is the reason why the U.S. has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's the reason why is because it's mostly symbolic, but it's seen as this, like, we can't give an inch to some world government body over how we take care of children, which that it's very symbolic, and it's all just kind of fear about the UN and what the UN is. But
I think there's also I'll just say it frankly, I think even setting aside the values, there's such an can I think of it in a way that doesn't feel blame? I think there's an arrogance, is the only way I can say it, that a parent would imagine they could never harm their child, that they could never cross that line, that their intentions, that their capacity is so pure and so right and so above external accountability. It's such a strange willful blindness for people who claim to understand sin, or particularly for people who claim to total depravity or that power corrupts or any of that, to say, well, but for parents, somehow they will always be benevolent, always be Christ-like, always be above reproach in this environment where they have no real accountability and a tremendous power imbalance over the children under their care. Just seems really out of touch with both understanding of abuse dynamics, as well as one's own personal, like, I don't know, even thinking about education and different things, like the idea that the way I feel like I as a parent could do it could be so irreproachable that no one better look at it. It's pretty wild take for Christians to opt for, I think.
Yeah, or my right to get it wrong accidentally matters more than to protect children. You know, like I deserve the right to try this because I can't raise children without it, and my right to get it wrong matters more than the protection, right? Like it's a very strange way of thinking about it, and it's also a very, very strange claim to me to say, like, we cannot raise godly children without this, right? Like, this is a thing that we need. And I, you know, and as you know, it's a very particular kind of eisegesis that you need to bring to the Bible to find that, and a very particular kind of theology that you need to hold to believe that God requires that.
I think so. And I think when I think of Piper, it's interesting because I have to reread that interview with him again. I think for Piper, and I would wager for someone like Tripp too, there's also this element of zeal and fervor.
Yes.
Like I question whether for them it's as much about like their right to do something as their sincere, almost fervent belief that if they don't do it this way, I don't know what, you know, whatever the stakes are. Like, so, and again, there's that kind of scrupulosity. There's that view that God is exacting, that if they don't do it exactly right, the stakes will be horrible. And again, I think that's a little bit, it's such a heavy burden, and also a little bit out of touch with how much we're all getting it wrong, for lack of a better, you know, I just think there's a sense, and maybe it comes, sometimes I'll talk to older parents, or as I get to be an older parent, realize this for myself, but you recognize that maybe the things you were so focused on doing or course correcting were not the things that ended up hurting your child, you know? And I think for many parents who maybe now are reckoning with children who are like, oh my gosh, this was so painful, they're thinking, oh, well, I was working so hard not to do X, Y, and Z that I experienced as a child. And so I think the tight rein on getting everything right, on following this one method or controlling children's behavior, all this sort of thing, it's so myopic to realize maybe this is a disheartening view, but I think it can be a freeing one. Like, there's a ton we're getting wrong and we're doing wrong as parents, despite our best intentions. Like this part of being human, like the imperfection of being human, and wow, it's such a treadmill to get on and feel that way. And I think what feels so sinister, I always think of the verse about the false teachers who sneak in and steal, kill, and destroy from the flock, is that it steals these precious years. Because I think in the early parenting years, it can appear that it works. It can appear that, oh no, this is working, so I feel justified in this choice. Like, I chose to spank, maybe I didn't like how it felt, but I'm doing it, my children are well behaved, I get compliments on them being well behaved, whatever. And it's not until later on that there may be the recognition, and maybe not, but it's such a gamble to be like, I'm opting for this and hoping that it won't have the kind of outcomes we hear a lot of people naming, and the disconnection. And it robs from families the connection they could have, the examples of patience and kindness, the perspective of God they can offer, all of it. And I think that's so insidious about it.
Yeah,
really coming from Christian teachers. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. But they would say, well, it's a risk to not do it, you know. You're risking your children's soul not doing it, you know. It's sort of this like unprovable thing.
It
Like,
is.
you do this,
It
your
is.
children will turn out worth it. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it can.
Well, and I wonder if we have time. I don't know if we do. We just chatting away. But I touched on it a little bit, but I think you speak to it so well. Can you summarize why it's so difficult to get compelling data on corporal punishment? You know, because you can pull,
Yeah.
there are lots of studies that have been done that kind of essentially say it's a net negative, but it's so difficult to get.
Yeah. I mean, oh, I just lost your sound. Oh,
Oops,
there you
can you
go.
speak to
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Was my
Yeah.
battery?
So, I mean, there are a lot of studies out there about it. And the studies, I mean, at most they say this is inconclusive. We can't really tell if it has an impact on behavior. And then others say we see a slight correlation with spanking and violent behavior in children. But even all of that data, and the researchers know this as well, like self-reported data on parenting is horrible. Like, this is the problem with studying infant sleep, for example. Like,
Yeah.
anytime like some sleeping coach online that's really grifty makes claims about anything, you have to filter that through parent reporting on their parenting practices is just awful, and it's impossible to verify unless you're going to do an incredibly invasive
Right.
study, or you
Unethical.
do
Yeah.
something so isolated that it's very hard to generalize. So like some studies on like parental attachment, for example, are done like by bringing parents into a lab setting and observing the behavior of the child when a parent leaves a room for a minute, for example, and trying to extrapolate and make observations about attachment based on maybe a series of interactions.
Yeah.
But then needing their parent to tell you what they're doing outside of that also. So it just, anytime you're looking at data on spanking, I think filtering it through a very heavy skeptical filter is a good idea. And the other thing that, you know, some of the data shows is that, you know, among families who spank, like you said, there are other things that sort of act as correctives or act as mitigators for harm. So it is not uncommon for parents to underreport the amount they spank and for children to either under remember what happened to them as children, as you would expect. Like with children who were spanked as toddlers, how would they remember anything, right? Maybe as they get older into the threes and fours, they might have a really hard memory. But anyway, there are lots of reasons why. But it's just the data is very, very bad, and I don't I don't even know that if we had good data, it would matter all that much.
Yeah.
Because the data isn't going to answer the question, is it ethical to
Yep.
to spank a child? It's not going to answer that question for you. It might answer the question, did it make this child stop biting his sister?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, sure, but like that doesn't answer the question, was it an ethical choice to spank your child for biting his sister? That's not the same question. So
Yeah. Or could the behavior have been altered via a
yes,
different means?
yeah,
Let alone the question I think Christians should be asking of, is this Christian behavior
yes,
to treat another human being this way? Is this
yeah,
the way of Jesus? And I think to a certain extent, I think the research can be helpful, but to a certain extent, yeah, I think it's certainly irrelevant because a lot of people don't care, because if they believe the Bible said
yeah,
something, it doesn't matter if you
yeah,
had crystal clear research. But secondly, it's kind of like, why are we interested in the question of, is it right to hit my child? And I like to use the word hit because I think we use a lot of euphemisms for it, like spank or swat, but this is functionally what's happening.
yeah.
And so, yes, I know sometimes sometimes people, when they say spank, mean a swat on the hand or things like this, and they mean this kind of different level, but this is still what we're doing, is we're hitting. And I think just asking that question is like, why are we looking for reasons to justify that kind of behavior? we're free not to. I don't know.
Yeah.
Why would we opt for that if we don't feel like we have to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my thought on the research on this, because people can find the data and use it because it's so inconclusive. Both sides can use it to sort of justify, see, it doesn't do anything horrible, or they can find the study that says spanking. There's one that kind of the finding was like children who were spanked by family members, if they were in like a community where all the kids were spanked, so like if they're in like a family integrated church where all the children were spanked, then it is less likely that their relationships with parents will be impacted later because they perceived it as normal as children.
Okay.
That kind of implies that, which is understandable, right? I mean, if you don't perceive your parents as more vindictive or more abusive than parents around you, you aren't going to be, terrified by or really angry or maybe less angry at your parents, or you feel like you shouldn't be angry at your parents because everybody else is being subjected to the same thing. So
well, some of it too, it's just this little snapshot. Like maybe what someone might say at age 20 might be different than what might say at age 30 or age 40. Even when we talk about abuse dynamics, a lot of people don't even have the vocabulary to name, when we're talking about child abuse, to name that. I think the average age of reporting child sexual abuse is like mid 40s to late 50s, where a lot of times, so it can take decades sometimes for people to even be able to name those things. And I think what the cognitive dissonance always gets me as well. We have statistics, even for reported incidents of domestic abuse, that should sober us all, like and so much happens. That's what's reported. So much happens behind closed doors. Children are so vulnerable. To me, it's such a bizarre choice. And then we haven't even gotten into the egregious Christian resources. There are abuse manuals under the name of Christ. It makes me so angry when I read them, and I don't like to give them a lot of time because I like to think most people recognize the harm of things like the pearls and things like Raising Godly Tomatoes and things like these books that are saying essentially abuse your child psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, across the board. And yet these still circulate. These still circulate hand to hand. And I think, and I hear this in anecdotal stories, people will talk about sometimes parents maybe start out carefully with how they spank, or they want it to be rare, but then they have a child who's not compliant or who's neurodivergent, or especially in communities that maybe are quiverful or other things, they have more children than they can control. Or they're more overwhelmed, or the needs, there's a utilitarian element of like, I can't run my household unless I blanket train my child, right? And these tools become really popular in certain communities because of other goals. And I think we need to name that in at hopefully sensitive ways, but in discussions of spanking, because there's no safeguard for abuse. So there's no safeguard. And so it's incredibly dangerous and irresponsible, let alone when you're talking to a parent to say, are you willing to take that gamble? To say, as communities, it is bananas that there are churches that have spanking rooms where parents can take their children. This is just so far, like, I would just love, hopefully in a non-shamey way, but anyone who comes across this video to say, this should not feel normal to us as followers of Jesus, that this is how we treat the children in our midst. When we see children brought to Jesus, he blesses them. His taking them lands like a blessing on them. Like the idea that children are experiencing harm in our communities, that they are being hurt, that they're being long-term impacted, should make us all, I think, quake in our boots, among other things. This is horrible, and I think we need to work to change it as much as possible, and through different means possible. And I did want to say, because sometimes I hear from people, I know there are a lot of parents who carry deep regrets. I know this is a tender thing. Parents who started out that way and then have come to a different conviction can often be overwhelmed with regret. I sometimes hear from parents who don't know how to stop, who maybe recognize that they're out of control with spanking or with their methods. And I really appreciate the honesty of those parents, because I think it's much more often for parents to be fragile and defensive and be like, I don't even want to look at that horrible thought. And I mean, obviously we can't give professional advice here. That's not what we're doing. But I would say for those parents, like, there is help, people who can walk you through ways to help yourself regulate, to get into therapy, to understand why you're drawn to this, why you're responding in this way. Because I think a lot of times parents, maybe this sort of teaching enables scenarios where parents are operating in ways that maybe horrify themselves. Children are experiencing harm, but this sort of teaching, parents are like, well, I guess this is what I'm supposed to be doing, though. I just can't do it right, so I'll pray more, I'll try and ask God to help me, when really they need some help to work through their own experiences as a child, their own patterns, their own inability to regulate their behavior, they need help. They need real help, not just advice to, like, I think Ted Tripp's advice is like, leave the room and pray until you're calm or something. Like, but people need practical tools. Like, what do I do though when I feel explosive rage toward my child? And these are things I think people in the theoretical spanking conversation don't talk about, because we'd much rather imagine abusive parents as cardboard cutout villains who are the really bad. And yes, there are evil. I do want to say, I do want to name that. I'm not saying every parent has the capacity to be egregiously abusive, but when I'm talking about parents who are struggling with this and don't understand how to get that, particularly if they were raised in chaotic or violent homes, I think, man, if you don't have help and new tools, like, it's very difficult to sort through the stresses of parenting and young children. And so I just want to applaud those parents for attempting to name that, attempting to find a different way, and invite you to keep pressing into that and to keep trying to prioritize working for change, because I don't think reading the next self-help book or trying a new method can really help parents learn skills to regulate or to stop trying to control their children's behavior in moments of frustration, if that's been the pattern. And I'm so glad there are some resources. I mean, I do think social media is a grace for this. There are a lot of free resources available to people who can look into this. But it's a lot. It's a conversation.
Yeah, it is a lot. And I know I would just echo not wanting parents to feel shame about it. I mean, if a parent who is like regularly spanking is watching this and you've gotten this far, I'm like, thanks for watching. I'm kind of surprised. And our goal isn't to come across as full of judgment and shame, but as just wanting better and more connection, wanting better for children, wanting more freedom and safety, and just ability to be children who aren't afraid of the world around them. I think even parents who think they consistently apply corporal punishment still create an environment where their kids know they could mess up enough that they could be hit. And that's just a hard, uncomfortable reality. But I think it's an important one to name it. So
it's important. And last thing, and then I want to see if we have any comments to respond to here, is also to sort of encourage people in churches, teachers, pastors. Sometimes I think about that and the way these resources circulate, and maybe Christian leaders are either unaware or haven't bothered to read them, but just to encourage people who are in those positions to be attentive to what families are consuming, because a lot of them, I think, are out of touch. And I do think it's maybe pastorally negligent when families are being essentially mentored by books or resources or influencers, and it's impacting not only the families under your care, but the children under your spiritual care in your church community.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities. I think collectively we can work for better. I'm optimistic about that. I do think, I don't know, I do think the trajectory is shifting with this generation in a way it wasn't. And I don't know if that's the fruit of Dobson being so pivotal and kind of the 80s and 90s being such a heyday and those adults now parenting, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, me too.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there were any comments that I wanted to respond.
Yeah. Okay. Hyper-reformed voices. Okay, yeah, hyper-reformed voices are really captivating young folks. This is true. It's true. I see a lot of strange allies for culture war, and yeah, people being drawn into this new iteration of Vision Forum, the promises that
I haven't heard of that. I'm moving my phone here.
Yeah. Okay, I shared some of Marissa's posts and Flourishing Families. I got a message. I'm very concerned for you. Oh, I'm sorry. Basically said these people are dishonest, have perverted minds. Yeah, it can be very difficult to reckon with a challenge. I mean, it goes back to that roots of people don't want their parental authority challenged, even metaphorically. Like, how dare someone challenge that? The promises they sell with it, yes, a lot of promises come through this. The mashup of fundamental legalism and the prosperity gospel. You always have such good insights. Violence equals love, even if they can't define penal substitutionary atonement. Absolutely. There's this, and that becomes a core message. Violence equals love. Someone said they can't understand God's ways till they're converted. They are warped. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, just in terms of kids being subhuman or
yeah, I'm not sure if that's the kids or us talking about this, but either way, I mean, that's kind of a, I guess you can never be wrong if you think anyone who disagrees with you isn't converted. I mean, yeah, I don't know if there can be productive conversation in those things. Parallelism filled wisdom, really sure, goods, the other should have gravity. Gosh, we should read this in real time. The Corinthians were taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, and the Lord made them ill, and some of them died, but I don't see Christians thinking they should follow that pattern. That's a good point. A commenter, I haven't followed up on it, but a commenter this week pointed out, and I thought this was interesting, that we see in the book of Acts, Paul being driven from the synagogue and beaten, but we never see Christian churches operating in that way. And I thought that was interesting. It could be an argument for silence, but I think it's worth noting that, yeah, there was that pattern, but what we see the Christians being instructed to do is disfellowship if there's a problem, not like flog someone from your, that's interesting. Jesus was the last to be punished for sin. Everything is effeminate in the Reformed Twitter streets. This is
that one.
Yeah, I wonder what an adult would say in response to, do you need to be physically punished for your sins? I hear from some people who mention this, and they, particularly in the post recently, that was kind of like parents saying, this so painful for me that now I have to spank you. And a couple people commenting how as children they kind of responded with, well, don't then, or why make yourself do it? And essentially the idea is belief that God does physically punish them in different ways if they don't. So yeah. As a parent who spanked a little bit and regrets it, spanking is lazy parenting. I tell all of my friends with younger children there are better ways. Yeah, I've heard that. Get the punishment over with and be done. And I hear that sometimes too, and I think it's really worth noting that that's such a parent-centric perspective, because I think for the parent, it feels like, great, it's done, we did that, and I got my compliance. But and it's part of why I ran the series, trying to imagine a child's perspective, because I don't know if that's the case. I mean, yeah, a child learned to comply and probably not cry about it. I don't know if that means it's done in the way that it's often presented.
Right.
Anything else you see here?
Yeah. I'm just thinking one and done thing, like the one and what is done, getting the compliance, or the one and done, like you've been punished, now we can move on? Like, what's the underlying belief there? That it's hard for me to hear that and think that there's not, I think parents who say, well, it's not about punishment, it's about teaching. I think, well, that way of thinking, that I find it hard to imagine that that's not about punishment, to say like one dealt with it, like you've gotten your comeuppance, now it's done. You know, it's sort of that's about a kid getting their comeuppance, you know.
Right. And often that's paired with like restored fellowship, like and it's again, it's the either or dilemma of like it's either that or grounding for weeks or something. There's often an extreme example. And I think, well, often you're requiring a child to get over whatever they experienced and reunite with the person who hurt them. So again, it's all from the parent's perspective. Oh, look, that's so much better for our relationship. But I really question the capacity for it even to be safe for a child to honestly name that wasn't okay with them or that hurt them. If I heard a preacher link spanking being outlawed in Germany to persecution, and that being a cause of decline of Christianity on the spot statistics. Okay. Yeah. I hear some of things like that too, of like the on the spot statistics of kids are less spanked now and more depressed. You know, these sort of like linkages that people make.
It's spanking. It's definitely none of the other things.
I never look back and think I'm glad I spanked in that instance, or I wish I spanked more. I only think I wish I spanked less. Oh, I appreciate that honesty. Yeah. Yikes. Children will be overcome by the folly bound up in your hearts. Yeah, people worry about what other parents will think of a child's behavior, for sure.
Always.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much. We should model respect by treating them. I told my mom off for spanking me around age 12. Wow. Someone says if you've done your job right, you shouldn't have to spank your kids after they turn 10. Right. Oh, it looks like they told their parent. Dobson said that. Yeah, we didn't even touch on the way that children are often spanked well into adolescence.
Yeah.
Because
it's supposed to be done by then, right? Like if you've done it, you have to.
Right, and if it was so effective, would you still have to? But also, again, it's the same problem. Parents have no other tool, so as long as you still overpower your child, and of course it becomes extremely problematic in teen years. Integrated services are a growing trend in reformed spaces, and I see these conversations all the time. Absolutely. Train them at home to sit through church on Sundays with spanking. Oh, yes. Yes. And the services are so long, as someone said. Absolutely. It's very hard. Why are we defending violence? Yes. Okay. Gosh, so many good comments. I wish it saved them.
I know.
So I could look at them more.
Transcript and the comments but yeah, it just really doesn't. So I don't know. Maybe there's, but they're different. Yeah. Thank you for all of these comments and for all of that.
I don't know if I can skim them all. My phone's about to die from my battery. If I just disappear, you'll know that's what's going to happen. Yes, CPS horror stories. Anyway, we need to wrap up anyway. Any final thoughts?
No, this has been great.
This has been great. Thank you. Wow, there's so many. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm going to get to the end of it, but I'm not. There's so many more.
So many. I feel like at the end one of these, I'm like burning a book or something. I'm like, oh, there are all these great thoughts. I have no way.
No, I know. And I know it's almost this week when things blew up. I was like, I really do try and respond to comments. I count it no small privilege to hear your all stories or to hear your thoughts. And I realized, our days are maybe limited being able to do that, but I appreciate it. So do message us if there's something you'd hope we would answer or just want to share with us. We value that.
Yes. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been great. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. It's always good to talk to you. Thank you. We'll do it in a couple weeks.
Yes. Another topic. Yes, my TradWife article should be up tomorrow or the next day. So finally,
that would be great. Good. Yeah. Any final thoughts on what's next? So TradWife article's coming. I'm finishing up this series on corporal punishment. Probably take a break for Holy Week and come back after Easter with some book summaries that I recorded a while ago to post. What about you?
Well, I'm starting drafting the first chapter. And so I'm thinking as I kind of get going on the research of that, I might start doing some mini deep dives into that.
Yeah.
I also have the ethics series that I've been talking about doing and just have not got around to doing.
I know I have my sin series I really want to do, so eventually. And some of it I'm realizing as we get more into the drafting of the book, we might get quieter on social media for a while. I don't know. And then come back
a little bit.
Come back in the fall. Like I have so many ideas, but we'll see.
We'll see. Okay. Thank you for this.
Thank you guys. Good to see you. Good night, friend.